For the women who remained, when a city fell in the ancient world, the struggle had only just begun. The living, breathing symbols of a city's loss, they were more than just collateral damage. Their agony was a premeditated, intentional and public act intended to break more than just their bodies. It was not a result of war. It was intended to destroy their identity itself. This is the hidden history of humiliation, when the most cruel penalties were meted out to the wives, daughters and mothers of the conquerors rather than to soldiers. You won't find this story in the great histories of philosophy or hero myths. They were exhibited as military booty, beaten and forced into slavery. The last and most pleasant reward for the winners was their dignity. For them, punishment was a public spectacle meant to break the spirit just as much as the body, and it wasn't limited to a prison cell. The intention was to create a scar that was unlike any physical injury. However, what occurs when the most severe penalties are administered with a common object from a market booth rather than a sword? The fig and the radish have bizarre symbolic meaning. The depravity was all the more horrifying because the process started with such a commonplace object, a dried fig or a hard, knobby radish. This involved more than just pain. It involved ridicule. The instrument was an act of improvisation, a private and intolerable desecration of the public. There was nowhere for the accused woman to hide after being undressed from the waist down. The crowd's eyes concentrated to one as her hands were pinned. The crime, adultery, seduction, or any perceived breach of honor would be announced by a magistrate, or possibly by a disgruntled husband. The deed would then start with a calm, purposeful motion. This was neither an execution nor a medical operation. It was a horrible inversion of roles, a symbolic violation. The woman who was accused of sexual impropriety endured a forced public humiliation, making her body a living manifestation of her own embarrassment. The bodily agony was severe and instantaneous, a tough radish that was scraped and damaged. Forcing a dried fig inside resulted in a scorching, burning abrasion and tore the flesh. But in comparison to the deeper hurt, the bodily suffering was just temporary. The awareness that her body had been used as a prop for public mockery was the longer torment. To make the humiliation even worse, the item was occasionally paraded and shattered, or simply left in situ. Her permanent shame was now symbolized by a common food item that one might have eaten that same morning. The once pristine body was now forever stained and exposed. In addition to the immediate trauma, the consequences were disastrous. The raw, damaged flesh was vulnerable to infection in an era without antiseptics, resulting in persistent discomfort and permanent scarring. Socially, the act destroyed her dignity and privacy. The woman who entered the Agora as a neighbor or wife departed as a spectacle. Her family suffered embarrassment. The future of her children was permanently changed. This type of physical deterioration was a tool of social death in Athens, where civic standing and reputation were the only real money. What would happen to a woman in the marketplace for something as basic as defiance, though, if that was the penalty for a fictitious offense? What happens if humiliation is turned into a kind of performance art? Bodizo, the pain of being in the spotlight. Of all the shames, the penalty known as bodizo was the most widely publicized. It started in the Athenian Agora, the roaring center of the city, rather than in a pitch-black jail. There was no private room here. It was the marketplace, a gathering place for citizens, merchants and philosophers. Being brought here was the most humiliating experience, not as a free woman, but as a total joke. She stood bare against a pole, baking in the hot Mediterranean sun. A lash was less damaging than public nudity in a culture that was fixated on female modesty. This was a planned act intended to increase her humiliation, not only exposure. Slaves, merchants, and neighbors would walk past her, viewing her as a warning story rather than a real person. Old men would point, children would laugh, and some would even throw trash or spit. The punishment flourished on the participation of the crowd, so the guards would do nothing. It was an unrelenting physical torture. Her skin burnt from hours of sun exposure. Her mouth felt super dry and weakness made her legs shake. Hunger gnawed at her, making it even worse. Dust from the marketplace clung to her sweaty skin. Insects swarmed, freely crawling on her mouth, eyes, and wounds. The scene grew more hideous the longer she was kept there. A once respected woman, possibly the wife of a citizen, was diminished to a warning to the public. This is the result of disrespecting your gods, your husband, or the polis. However, the elimination of her dignity was the greatest wound, which was never physical. A woman's worth in Athens was based on both her reputation in the home and her modesty, but Dezo undermined both at once. Because the marks caused by the exposure were invisible, it was worse than a beating, a stigma that would never go away, a shame that followed her home, and rumors that tainted her family's reputation. For hours or a whole day, some people put up with this. A few died of heat stroke or were abandoned to perish, never to be seen again. Only until the humiliation had ended and the example had become ingrained in the collective consciousness did the Athenians view the punishment as accomplished. Dezo, however, was not intended to chastise the body. It was designed to break the spirit and make a woman's body a symbol for the world. You are not your own property. The city owns you and has the right to strip you naked whenever it pleases. However, what could be worse than being in the spotlight? It was a penalty that took away not just your clothing, but also your identity. The last cut. In ancient Greece, stigma and shaved heads were common. There was more to a woman's hair than just how she looked. It was an expression of her femininity, pride, and individuality. Her honor would be taken away if it were taken away. This is why one of the most degrading penalties for women was head shaving, frequently coupled with severe beatings. In addition to causing pain, this punishment was intended to permanently disgrace a wife who was accused of infidelity, or a lady who was caught disobeying her guardian's orders. She was naked and vulnerable after having her hair chopped off in public. She was considered forever disgraced in a society where having long hair was a sign of morality and beauty. Every time one of her neighbors looked at her, the stigma followed. However, shame was insufficient on its own. It just got worse with added beatings. Her head bore the public stigma of dishonor, while her body had the injuries from being struck by fists, belts, or rods. This combination was particularly prevalent among slaves. In order to set them apart from free women, masters would shave their heads, reinforcing their subservience through brutality. This penalty was severe, since it was permanent. A physical wound might heal, but if hair ever grew back the same, it would take months or possibly years. She was unable to conceal her shame at the time. Her naked scalp always made a bigger impression than words when she appeared in public. Losing one's hair as a form of punishment was considered a sign of identity loss in ancient Greece. It served as a harsh reminder that a woman's body did not belong to her, especially when combined with the blows of a beating. Either the state, her lord, or her spouse owned it. In addition to stealing her dignity, they might also take away the very things that made her a woman, leaving her with nothing except the final unseen mark of their dominance.